Anthropological associations. It's a great pleasure to have our colleague Monica Heller to give her paper.
Hegemoniku Gakai no Kaicho no Monica Heller de Gozaimasu. Je suis la présidente de l'association hégémonique. I am the president of the American Anthropological Association, otherwise known as ambulatory hegemony. It's an interesting position for me to be in. Many of you here know this, but some of you don't. I am the second president, actually, in the history of the AAA to be neither American nor based in the United States. Which is an interesting position to find myself in. I certainly never, if you had told me 5-10 years ago that I would be here, I would have gone like, not possible. But the fact that I am in this position, I think, already says something. What it says, we will find out. I'm not entirely sure. So I want to talk precisely about one of the issues that many people already have mentioned, which is the position of the AAA in world anthropologies. And I certainly, can't claim to have started the AAA on this path. My predecessors have certainly prepared the terrain, notably Seth Lowe and Virginia Dominguez and Liz Mullings before me. But in some ways, I'm sort of the walking incarnation. And certainly has been the case for a number of years that there's been a recognition that as part of the reflexivity of anthropology in general, that we have to sort of think about the ways in which our national institutions are increasingly, in some sense, out of sync with what's going on in the development of ideas about anthropology and anthropological questions. So this is an interesting historical moment. I think there's more than I can say this afternoon about why it is that we are finding ourselves here, why it is that spaces like the AAA, like JASCA, like ABBA and others, like Wcaa, are increasingly overflowing the boundaries of the spaces that the institutions were initially set up to shape. And certainly I find myself probably at least once a week in a conversation about, well, what do you mean by American exactly? So the AAA, I think, has been, and people have mentioned this before, on a fairly long project of decolonization and internationalization. People have mentioned already the fact that a task force on world anthropologies was faster than the task force expected, turned into a standing committee on world anthropologies, which has been behind the development of a section of American Anthropologist, the flagship journal on world anthropologies. And I want to just talk a little bit about things that we started realizing about 5 years ago about membership and registration. Now, nobody before I started asking these questions. I was the program chair for the 2010 meetings in New Orleans and started asking questions about, who comes to these meetings? And it turns out that there were no records. We knew how many, but we didn't know very much about who they were, and certainly nothing about where they came from. So we started asking and started keeping track. So here are the figures, just to let you know, that in 2010, which is when we started keeping records, almost 20% of the people who came to the meetings were from outside the United States, based outside the United States, total of 67 countries, and the top 3, Canada, the UK, and Japan. 2011, when the meetings were actually outside the US altogether in Montreal, went up to 30%, probably not too surprisingly, 86 different countries, Canada again, UK, and Australia in third place. We can have a conversation about why there are so many more countries when it was held in Montreal. My hypothesis is that the Department of Homeland Security has something to do with that. That was supposed to be a joke. 2012, back to 21%, again, Canada, UK, and Japan. 2013 in Chicago, 19%, Canada, UK, and Japan. So we have a fairly robust situation in which a good 20% of the people who show up at the annual meetings, and that is fairly close to the longer-term membership, are based outside the United States. When I tell that to people who, like me, are based outside the United States, they go, uh-huh. When I tell that to my American colleagues, they go, oh, really? So somehow or other, this rather large chunk of people has been going unnoticed. And I have some breaking news for you for the interim 2014 figures. The meetings will be in Washington, D.C. in December. I say they're interim because there's 2 phases of registration. The second phase is going to open up round about now. And so we have 78 countries represented, almost as many as in Montreal, almost 23% from outside the US, with Canada, the UK, and Germany being the top 3 countries. So yes, there was a kind of an Anglo-something, although, Francine and I are loyal members, only the fidèles des fidèles of the AAA, so not just, don't read English into the Canada part necessarily, okay? So there's been something that's been going on, actually I'll just leave that there for a moment. There's been something that's been going on in the AAA, I would say, even before we started consciously to think about it, in the sense that clearly many of us have started to use the AAA as a space to do something world-ish, something global, something planetary. We're very curious to know what that is. We've started asking some questions. Any information you can have to give us would be extremely helpful. But we're guessing, it's a number of different things. Some of them are hegemonic type things, like the fact that many people who are based outside the United States were, like me, nonetheless trained there, and as graduate students got inducted into the school of the AAA, or into the church of the AAA. In some cases, it's that it's an annual meeting, and so you have a sustained conversation, unlike some other groups which have meetings only every 2 years. It's a place where lots of airlines fly to, so you can bring together people from lots of different places if you want to have an international conversation. And indeed, many, many panels are composed not necessarily of people from the same place, but people from all over the place. So we seem to have been recognized as available for internationalization from the ground up, if you like. It's sort of a grassroots movement, which happens to coincide with where we think things ought to go anyway. So the question is how to use that in ways which are productive and maybe help render visible and more productive some of the processes that are going on in any case. So this is what's happening, whether or not we try to get it to happen or not. But at the same time, what we're facing is the fact that, like most of you, with the exception, I suppose, of supranational groups like the Latin American group or Wcaa, most of us are bound one way or the other by nation-state structures or possibly supranational structures like the EU. So in a way that I want to sort of borrow Michael Billig's term of banal nationalism here, there are ways in which we hardly ever think about it, but the AAA had to get registered somewhere, as did Antropólogos Sin Fronteras, in some state with some set of regulations, which then have to be obeyed. So it's founded in a place, it has to obey the laws of that place, it has to obey the tax regulations of that place, whether or not the members are citizens of that place. Funding tends to be organized still in nation-state structures. So for many of our members, research funding comes from the National Science Foundation. For those of us who live in Canada, it comes from the Conseil de recherche en sciences humaines, the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, and which has its own set of constraints. So just to give you one example, I've been trying to get funding for a project on transnational mobilities of Franco-Canadians, actually of mobilities, whether national or transnational, and the methodology really is facilitated by having a team of people, including colleagues who live in places like Switzerland and Finland. But the rules of the Conseil de recherche en sciences humaines are that they will, because this is Canadian taxpayers' money, they will only pay for Canadians to do research outside of Canada, or for non-Canadians to do research in Canada, but heaven forbid I should ask my Finnish colleague to do research on French-Canadian hockey players who are in Finland, which would be a whole lot easier and a whole lot cheaper than me schlepping over there and trying to learn Finnish and Swiss German, let's say, if we want to do a comparative study. So we are blocked in the development of our own research structures, as well as in the development, if it weren't for Wenner-Gren, I don't know what we do, but most of our funding structures prohibit the kinds of transnational, international collaborations that we actually want to set up. Then there's the whole question of citizenship and access to institutional spaces. I mentioned half-jokingly the Department of Homeland Security, but the fact of the matter is that many people who might otherwise come to the AAA came when it was in Montreal because they would have had difficulty coming or don't want to deal with American regulations and various forms of border patrol. Canada has its own. I don't want to say Canada is so wonderful. But there are problems of citizenship which then regulate access not only to work and residence in countries, but simply to being able to participate in institutional spaces like a conference or an executive board. People who don't have a passport at all, needless to say, have an even greater problem. So all of these kinds of banally nationalist all of these structures then, of course, as many of you have already talked about today, necessarily influence the possibilities for the creation of discursive spaces, which then develop their own cultures of knowledge production and their own cultures of knowledge circulation. And so even if, with the best will in the world, we want to decolonize ourselves and open up those spaces, there are a lot of institutional structural barriers which we really have to think about overcoming. And I think we need to think, probably in some sense, I think this is a project for us, to think about the ways in which the processes of selection into these networks and the processes of selection into these spaces then produces certain kinds of cultures which make it, because we need to be able to speak to each other, also then somewhat go against a project of living together in more radical forms of difference. And I think that's really one of the challenges that we have. So what this lays down as groundwork, as a set of foundations, is a set of uneven and contradictory conditions. So this, to me, leads to a number of different questions, notably how the Wcaa might chart a future which enables a recalibration of relations of power and global circulations of knowledge from multiple sources without necessarily rendering invisible or doing damage to some of the forms of radical difference in perspective which we want to keep alive and in circulation. And so that raises the question of how do we build a conversational space where we can hold together in one frame different ways of understanding and different sets of objectives, different priority questions, different sets of concerns, and different kinds of practices. So that, as Setha has said, at the same time, we need to pay attention, on the one hand, to local and regional conditions and the realities of nation states with differing positions with respect to global circulations of capital, and try to build something across that. That raises then some questions, which I think in different ways many of us have been trying to ask in terms of how do we then build life in the Wcaa? What are the practices of the institution which allow it to function as, I think, an emergent discursive space, which allows for, in some sense, contradictory things to happen at the same time? I think we don't really yet have a good sense of what our rights and obligations are as differentially situated members. We don't have a good sense of who we want to speak to, and nor do I think we have a good sense of what it is we want to say and what it is we want to do, not necessarily always collectively as a rhinoceros or an elephant or a giraffe, but as a structure which enables at least several sets of projects to go on at the same time. So I think there's a number of different questions that the contradiction between the remaining national structures that we have inherited that are in contradiction with the transnationality that we're trying to actually instantiate and live raise for us. I think we're starting to ask those questions, but I also think that it really is time for us to move from the phase of building the institution to one in which we decide on a project, any project, a number of different sets of experimental modes of handling multilingualism or linguistic variation of various different kinds, quitte à tomber sur le visage. I mean, if we could trip and fall, that's okay. We learn from our mistakes. But we have to try some concrete projects, I think, at this point, and then track our processes and track our learning from them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Monica, for keeping your speech within the 15 minutes. And now I invite Susana Doris Matos Viegas to the podium.
So good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I want to thank Gustavo for this challenge to come and speak in this forum. He suggested me to be here because I was the president of the Association of Portuguese Anthropology from 2007 to 2009. And since the foundation of the Wcaa, because I was working very directly with João Pina Cabral, I've been able to accomplish and to see the development of the institution. So I was very glad when Gustavo told me that I could come and say something about, in this case, about the possibility of future actions of Wcaa. So I just thought by then, in what way could I contribute with a proposal? And you may find out in the end that it is too optimistic, perhaps even naive, but it's what I'm going to defend. So, and this the title is Crossing Anthropologies. In this presentation, I aim to contribute to one of the challenges of this panel, to address the critical institutional, political, and theoretical issues we still need to deal with to foster the mission of Wcaa. I propose to look at the specific issue of language and communication across the whole of anthropology. It fits into one of the Wcaa aims, and I quote, to promote a better understanding among anthropologists working in different languages and national and regional traditions in the context of a global network of communication. Support to politics of translation of minor languages into the most transversal language of English is, of course, one of the relevant ways of dealing with the issue. However, as Gustavo Lins Ribeiro also recognized, and I quote, translation of different anthropological materials into English is highly necessary, but not enough. Gustavo suggested that in order to avoid what he calls linguistic monotony, it would be important to translate German anthropologists into Japanese, Mexican, into German, etc. I will here propose future actions of Wcaa that could contribute to the struggle to improve anthropological diversity. Instead of a web of knowledge between nations, say Germany or Mexico, etc., I suggest the enforcement of web of knowledges through what João Pina Cabral calls ecumens of common languages, a strategic way of dealing with hegemony in a global world. Following the well-known perspective of Ufanitz that the global world is an undivided world of intercommunication constructing through ecumens, that is, webs of webs, ecumens of common languages are niches of intense communication that may become particularly empowering in the contemporary world. As João states, there is no doubt that in a globalized world, a sharing of everything that goes with sharing a language brings people together, gives them a feeling of sharing a common destiny, activates mutual interests. We live in a world in which cultural politics are of increasing significance. Now let's postulate that ecumens of common languages means anthropological academia sharing common readings, thus intellectual backgrounds. world anthropologists emerge from the recognition of, and I quote, the increasingly important role that non-hegemonic anthropologists play in the production and dissemination of knowledge on a global scale. So the main starting point I want to suggest is that we live in the contemporary world of anthropology. We have two ways in which we combine different traditions of anthropology and in different languages. One is that all of us need to, in some way, speak a little bit at least of English and have access to hegemonic anthropology. That's what everyone has to do in whatever part of the world. The other way of doing is the crossing anthropologies that we necessarily do because we do usually research in different places of the world, and we have to combine always at least two different traditions of anthropology because of the post-colonial condition in which we are. So we can't forget anymore of the places that the places where with whom we dialogue also have their own tradition of social sciences, folklore, whatever that is connected to anthropology. So now I'm going to talk of the situation of the anthropology in Portuguese as a case study. So I'm not saying that this is a specific case, but it's the one I know best, so it's my contribution. So in the case of anthropology in Portugal, a crossroads of the Euro-American routes of intellectual exchange and the South Atlantic routes has recently reaffirmed itself as an important mark of the way Portuguese social sciences intervene in the global scientific debate. As João and I showed in an article on anthropology in Portugal, from the mid-1990s, Portuguese social sciences and humanities integrated in the European Union received subsidies, programs of promotion of science, and internationalization happen in many different directions. And what I have to say has much to do with internationalization. So internationalization became a requirement for funding and employment. As you know, it is usually thought as if it was not historically situated. On the contrary, we know that internationalization of anthropological debate is, of course, a situated issue. Peter Fry's comments in the 2004 publication on anthropology in Brazil, in a book that was organized by Gustavo and Trajano, concerning the internationalization of Brazilian anthropology are opposite here. He shows that there is a correlation between the countries that Brazilian academics most visit and the nationality of the journals and books where they publish abroad. Furthermore, he notes by then that France and the United States remain very important, but that, and I quote, there is a growing importance of Portugal and the countries of Latin America in this partner visitation, end quote. In the decades that passed since the writing of these comments, which was exactly 10 years ago, by Peter Fry, there has been a significant increase in relations among academics writing in Portuguese and the crossing, I would say, I wonder what Susana Narowski thinks about this, of anthropologies in Portuguese and Spanish, as if it was a common ground of understanding, not a Luso-Spanish relationship, but an intercommunicative languages, particularly in the social sciences and humanities, and very specifically in anthropology. And so I'm going to give an example that, in a way, communicates with what has just been said about who participates in the conference. So in 2009, when I was the president of the Association of Portuguese Anthropology, we did a proactive politic in which we invited anthropologists coming from different parts of the world, from Brazil, but also from the United States and different places in Europe, anthropologists who, for many different reasons, usually because of fieldwork, knew Portuguese. So the Brazilians knew Portuguese as a native language, and the idea was exactly to force these people to talk to each other. And so in 2009, the conference of the Portuguese Association of Anthropology had half of the attendants were people coming from abroad. So only half of the participants were actually coming from Portugal. And in these other half of those coming abroad, More than the half of those were Brazilians, but the others were actually coming from Europe and the United States. Now, last year, the conference that took place last year, the conference of the Association of Portuguese Anthropology, already with economic crisis limiting dramatically the funding, an equivalent proactive politics of invitation was impossible. However, the figures of Brazilians, Spaniards, and people coming from many other parts of Europe repeated itself in a surprisingly approximate way. So this transversal crossing of anthropologies is important to impede what Gustavo Lins Ribeiro called the metropolitan provincialism, that is, the ignorance that hegemonic centers usually have of the production of non-hegemonic centers. But it also is important, and that's the main thing that I want to suggest, to share intermediary language, to use a scientific intermediary language, which is an important condition for in the area of negotiation on the global world. So I'm saying that it's not only that it's a way in which we bring people coming from hegemonic institutions to come and talk with us, but also that we are actually commuting with them, and this is creating something, and this is what I want to suggest. And so I come to the last section, which is a very direct proposal and the title is Ecumens of Common Languages, a Proactive Politics for WCAA. So, supporting and reinforcing ecumens of common language is, of course, subversive to what is commonly meant by internationalization, a key demand for funding in the contemporary academic world. In non-hegemonic institutions and countries, internationalization means writing and publishing in English. But this does not create necessarily a web of communication being heard. As Gustavo Lins Ribeiro recognized in the recently created section on world anthropologies in the American Anthropology Journal, being heard abroad is the most difficult challenge of non-hegemonic anthropologies, the exchange of theory and data among different anthropological communities. So anthropology in Portuguese has visibly exploited these possibilities of an intermediary space of negotiation over the past decade. And I gave you the example of the conference, but actually many other examples could be made. And one very important has to do with journals. So journals both in Portugal and more effectively, of course, in Brazil, have started to publish regularly contributions by colleagues from all over the world, including, in some cases, papers written in Spanish. So I would argue thus that one step towards being heard, the truly but more difficult international endeavor, would be approximated by allowing that high-standard journals written in non-hegemonic languages enter the big indexation systems from ISI to Scopus. And I'm not saying that I do like these systems, but I'm saying that they exist. And that, so following what I just said, this would not be nationalism or provincialism, but on the contrary, would empower these transnational ecumens of common language, which, as I hope I have convincingly argued, are particularly innovative in anthropology because of these crossings of different countries and traditions that anthropology need to deal with. So, in this vein, I propose WCAA delegates to promote a very specific action in making pressure so that journals in non-hegemonic languages around the world be integrated in those top world indexes of scientific journals. The mission of WCAA in achieving a more equitable international scene would thus be accomplished through the promotion of such actions because they could turn non-hegemonic languages in anthropology into high-standard hegemonic languages of communication.
Thank you, Susanna. We now turn to the paper of Somendra Mohan Patnaik.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm just coming from a parallel panel which Wcaa and Indian Anthropological Association is organizing, celebrating the 50 years of both the associations, so I was rushing against the time. Now, I have been listening to my colleagues in the morning session. Of course, not all of them, but many of them. My colleagues have been trying to pitch their argument and their perspectives in a global platform. And quite legitimately, we should talk about how Wcaa or IUAES can be a launching pad for future, a launching pad for the discipline of anthropology. But I propose to go the other way. I propose to go the other way by taking up a bottom-up approach. What is the presence of Wcaa? What has been the presence of Wcaa when viewed from the platform of a national association, Indian Anthropological Association? And that would talk about a view from below, a perspective from below. I'm not trying to say that such a perspective is not needed to have a launching ground, but this perspective is highly essential. I will start with one small incident. On one of the fine mornings of 2008, May 2008, I received a phone call, an international phone call, and a Japanese lady told me that she wants to know whether, as President Indian Anthropological Association, I'm coming to Osaka for the meeting of World Council of Anthropological Associations, to be held in July. By that time, I was aware of the formation of Wcaa in 2004. I came to know about it a little later. But IAA was passing through, Indian Anthropological Association was passing through a rough stretch in its institutional life, struggling hard with resource crunch, indifference of members to the uninspiring leaders, delay in the publication of the journal, and overdraft of the banks. Indian Anthropologist, which has been published by the association since 1971, was delayed by 2 years. It was primarily due to the successive departure or demise of two of its leaders. Pardon me if I take names about which you are not acquainted with. President J.S. Bhandari and the next senior vice president, Professor P.K. Bhaumik, who died in the same year. The official website of Wcaa mentioned that admission of new members will be on the recommendation of the majority of founding members. And at that time, it seemed quite tough for an association which was passing through turbulent waters to become a member of Wcaa. On receiving this phone call, I realized that there is some confusion between Indian Anthropological Society. My good friend, Ajit Danda, has been a founding member. And there is some confusion between Indian Anthropological Society and Indian Anthropological Association, two national bodies functioning from Calcutta and New Delhi respectively. I confessed to that anonymous call that neither IAA is a member of Wcaa, nor am I invited to attend the Osaka conference. She kept the phone telling me that she will get back to me after speaking to the chair of Wcaa. And the next morning, I received a phone call from Professor Junji Koizumi, who very clearly told me that he has seen the IAA website, and if we are interested in joining Wcaa, we should follow the procedure laid down by the website. He also said that if we expedite the process, then IAA can also attend the Osaka meeting, and the funding for delegates from developing countries and associations facing resource crunch should not be a problem. This conversation was not only historic, but also transformative for an association struggling hard to revive itself from the lanes of inertia. Indian Anthropological Association joined WCA in the next year and took part in 2010 biennial conference at Maynooth, Ireland, and rest is history. WCA addresses the question of world anthropology. My friend Gustavo has been passionately involved with this whole idea of world anthropology by creating a global network through effective communication among national anthropologists. This was certainly not to duplicate the efforts of IUAES, but to fill in a much-awaited gap between the interest of an individual anthropologist and the interest of an anthropological tradition of a nation at the national and regional level. The whole politics and ethics of representing the community of scholars at a national level remains problematic. As a young graduate student in late 1980s, I always used to wonder, how are these national delegates identified at the first place? And what has been their role in disseminating the information that would inspire the younger generation so as to create leaders of the future in anthropology? This has been a question which has been perpetually disturbing me, and like many other scholars, that what has led to this national delegation? And many of the national delegates would not speak about their role in public in the domestic platform. And that was a gray area, the manner in which ICAS or IUAES function. So the formation of WCAA was clearly addressing to this gray area, to this gap, which was long felt. This was a matter of great concern for most of the upcoming anthropologists at home who are willing to take up adventure of putting anthropology at unconventional sites, especially in a global context. Indian Anthropological Association was at the helm of its affair in 1978 when it organized the full Congress of IUAES under the leadership of Professor L.P. Vidyarthi at New Delhi in collaboration with several other institutes. It followed with, as you all know, two inter-congresses in India in 2004 and 2012 at Calcutta, Professor Chaudhary and Professor Behra, and at Bhubaneswar. While these served as windows to the international world of anthropological fraternity, the younger scholars found it difficult to get connected to the larger world due to several problems of a developing country like funding, problem of information flow, and hegemonic influence exercised by scholars from allied disciplines. These scholars from allied disciplines harnessed the full potential of the identity of an anthropologist abroad, but felt shy of claiming the same at home. This created a skewed relationship between anthropology and allied social sciences. Many of them went up to the extent of denying anthropology the status of an independent discipline in India, but called it as a branch of sociology or as if it is subsumed under sociology as comparative sociology. While this may look acceptable to many of us, including me, who believe in coexistence of anthropology with other disciplines on an interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary platform, when examined from the point of view of a student, a graduate student in South Asia, undertaking her master's or doctoral program, the issue is complicated with unresolving questions of identity, unresolving questions centering around identity, perceived expertise for jobs and opportunities of job for shortlisting and selection. The graduate students of anthropology in India feel they are rarely considered for teaching positions in sociology or even in development studies. On the contrary, students of economics, political science, and social work make it to positions in development and policy studies and managing NGOs in different parts of India. This is not to argue that there is no connection between these disciplines with development or policy studies, but to point out how anthropology has been marginalized in terms of its real potential in these fields. This has created a perpetual tension and anxiety in the younger minds about the future of anthropology and future of anthropologists in India. In November 2009, when the Association of Social Anthropologists of United Kingdom and Commonwealth decided to hold its 2012 annual conference at Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi, the community of anthropologists in India felt marginalized and insisted on a more inclusive and egalitarian collaboration among various national bodies, furthering the interest of the discipline in the subcontinent. Without going into the details, which I do not want to remember, and I have forgotten about it, I would reiterate that but for World Council of Anthropological Associations' commitment to support the regional and national associations of anthropology, and the commitment of my global partners, even every anthropological association, including Wenner-Gren Foundation, American Anthropological Association, and all of my world colleagues supported our case that any conference organized in Indian soil in the name of anthropology should be inclusive, taking into account the various institutions which are engaged in furthering the interests of the discipline. But this was possible primarily through the Wcaa membership of Indian Anthropological Association. It would not have been possible to organize the conference in more inclusive way where the senior and younger anthropologists from length and breadth of India participated in the first ever Wcaa symposium organized in New Delhi in April 2012. One of the most important initiatives taken during the conference was to launch a young anthropologist forum comprising graduate students from both sociology and anthropology. This was done in the presence of the then chair of ASA, Professor James Fairhead, and the General Secretary of Indian Sociological Society, and I was also present there. And this young anthropologist forum is doing extremely well in terms of getting connected to other graduate students in different countries. And that is not to duplicate the efforts of Indian Anthropological Association, but to create a space for the next generation leadership, which Indian anthropologists have been continuously facing. Now, the presence of WCA and ASA in India in 2012 invigorated the discipline and transformed the capacities and enriched through effective communication among the younger scholars from India and abroad. India's participation in two of the WCA task force on ethics and advocacy and outreach initiatives have proved very useful exercises where the graduate students are voluntarily contributing immensely. The young scholars are taking keen interest in the activities of the task force that are organized at home, and we are very close, as Virginia was telling the other day, we are very close to the initiation of Anthropology Without Border chapter in India. We have already initiated dialogues with the NGOs and donor agencies. Now, what has led to a sudden absence of leadership in Indian anthropological space? I'm not talking of association. Post-1980 scenario marked with a complete vacuum because of death of Professor Vidyarthi, death of many senior leaders, and appropriation of anthropological identity by the sister disciplines. Now, this appropriation of anthropological identity suited the individual interest, and the loss was perpetual for the discipline. It was creating some kind of vacuum, as if the subject has no strength, and the real strength real strength lies in the allied subjects. And this is definitely a space in which we all grew up as the graduate students of India. Now, in post-1980 scenario, it was clearly observed that many of the national bodies like Planning Commission, Anthropological Survey of India, the census operations, the national museums, at one point of time, they were led by established anthropologists. And in post-80s and early 90s period, many of them were led by either administrators or economists or sociologists. Anthropological Survey of India was led by one of a historian turned administrator who wanted to replicate 1891 Risley's study of People of India project. If you look into the whole machinery of Indian Anthropological Survey of India, it went to replicate a colonial practice of identifying the similar kinds of cultural and physical traits of people of India. They are all available from Oxford University Press, 1991 onwards. And the community of anthropologists seriously protested that this is not the kind of anthropology which India should project before itself or before a global audience. But it was primarily due to the lack of political power, primarily due to the lack of anthropological leadership. Now, when Wcaa came to India in 2012, we have been writing letters to, and Wcaa has been Thomas have been very kind in writing letters to university grant commissions and other places of India to open anthropology in the school curriculum. And we have given justification that anthropology, if it is opened in the school curriculum, it would produce better citizens and citizens which are more responsive to or more sensitive to the cultural differences, thereby creating space for tolerance and space for international peace. So finally, I would like to say that the asymmetrical relationship between anthropology and its allied subjects, and especially sociology, is not only specific to India in particular, but also South Asia as a whole. Though Sri Lanka has produced world-class anthropologists, the presence of anthropology in academic world in its academic world is negligible. Much of the academic corpus of its intellectual tradition is named after ethnic studies primarily dominated by the allied social sciences, and anthropology is taught as one or two papers within the Department of Sociology. And this is the similar in Nepal. In Nepal, it is still dovetailed into the discipline of sociology. In Bangladesh, the establishment of university departments of anthropology in Rajshahi, in Dhaka, in Chittagong is a post-1980 phenomena, while the introduction of anthropology in Pakistan, especially in Karachi and Lahore, materialized around 1970s. The Himalayan kingdom of Bhutan is yet to begin a tradition of teaching and research in anthropology in an institutional framework. There are researchers, wonderful researchers, pursuing studies in Bhutan, but there is a lack of institutional base of anthropology in Bhutan. Indian Anthropological Association is negotiating with colleagues from different countries in South Asia for a stronger institutional presence in the region. A South Asian platform for strengthening the institutional base of the discipline is the need of the hour, and Indian Anthropological Association is carrying out its negotiation at different levels to give it a shape at the earliest. And I'm sure our linkage with the World Council of Anthropological Association will come very handy in floating this kind of association in future, and especially foundations like Wenner-Gren Foundations, Leslie and all, they are here. I would like to approach them at an appropriate time for such a kind of funding to create an association of South Asian anthropologists, leading to a strong institutional base where the young and the elders are all happy with the practice of a discipline. Finally, I would just like to give one humble submission that I agree with Wcaa in the morning, his presentation, that World Council of Anthropological Association should not be allowed to lose its identity at any cost. And we should not also be resistant in terms of opening our windows or opening our doors to IUAES. And there should be definitely some kind of mechanisms, some kind of federation, some kind of space where we talk to each other on an equal footing, on an equal platform, because our roots are different. In one case, IUAES has a wonderful tradition of pulling all individual efforts together, the commissions together, and standing up on the commission on a global platform, and it has a long-standing history of success. But at the same time, there was a gap between the gap in terms of a disconnect between the associational traditions or the national traditions, and that is what WCA is addressing. And if WCA can also address this issue, not only in terms of a world anthropology, but also incorporating what would be the nature of regional anthropologies and how the regional anthropologies could connect to the world anthropology. Thank you.
Thank you, Somendra. Unfortunately, we had programmed two other colleagues, Bella Feldman-Bianco from Brazil and Karl-Heinz Kohl from Germany, but the two of them, for different reasons, couldn't come. So, Bella sent her paper in the last minute, and I'm not sure if Susanna will be able to make any comments on it, but we will surely publish Bella's piece. And I now ask Susanna Narodsky to play her discussant role, please.
I'm probably going, I hope I'm going to be, not take the 15 minutes and see if we can have a little bit of discussion at least. I've just been like taking notes, and I'm going to try to highlight a few issues that seem to me very important in this World Anthropologist Network project, the original project, but also in what I think the World Council for of Anthropological Associations is aiming at. In my view, the way I understand it, I always understood it in this way, the Red de Antropologías Mundiales, the World Anthropologist Network, had a political aim, fundamentally. This aim was to supersede metropolitan hegemonies. And I think this is what, in a way, Gustavo understands or talks about when he talks about cosmopolitics. In any case, in my view of this, is that this superseding of metropolitan hegemonies is based in three main aspects. The first one is awareness. Fundamentally raising the awareness, the mutual understanding, but not only understanding, but the fact that there are other anthropologies out there, and not only the hegemonic anthropologies. But this awareness is also about respect. So not only knowing that there are these other anthropologies around, but also respecting these other anthropologies as they are, which means not trying to transform them into something else. And finally, this awareness is also an issue of recognition and value. So it's not only being aware, not only respecting, but giving value to these other knowledges, which means, for example, in a very basic way, citing them, thinking that what is written in other languages and coming from other anthropological traditions has value, for example, for the anthropologists who are working in the hegemonic tradition. And this often doesn't work this way. I mean, for example, when somebody this morning, I think it was Michal Buchowski, was talking about the importance of consulting local scholarship and respecting this scholarship when one goes and does fieldwork in another place. It's not only consulting, it's also like really involving this knowledge in the production of our knowledge. So first, awareness with these different aspects. Then conversation. So conversation, I think, is something else. Conversation is really engaging, acting on very directly trying to collaborate with other traditions of anthropological knowledge, with other colleagues, and trying to understand what their priorities might be. So one of the I think main issues in these different traditions, knowledge traditions in anthropology, is that we are not all focusing on the same priorities. So what might be important because of historical reasons very often in Central European anthropology, for example, might not be as important or even at all important in other areas of the world. So this conversation, this really engaging and being open to create different collaborations is, I think, another of the objectives or the ways to produce this cosmopolitics. The last aspect, I think, is the aspect of the actual production of knowledge and its relationship to such issues as language, very importantly, but also the nation building in a way. And I think language and nation building are very often go together. And I would add to these two aspects which have been repeatedly mentioned during this conversation that we have been having here, I would like to add a third aspect of knowledge production, which interestingly has not been mentioned at all during this conversation, which is the different theoretical frameworks that we use. And this is something that I want to put forward because it points to the heterogeneity within languages and within national traditions. There is, and this is, I think, very important because if we think of these ecumenes that Susana Matos Viegas was talking about, these ecumenes of common languages, they are not only about actual language, natural languages, so to speak, but also about theoretical languages or paradigmatic languages. I don't know how to express it. Because beyond the language, the understanding between particular languages, and I mean, I think of a concept which is used sometimes by linguists in Spain who speak about sesquilinguismo. So sesquilinguismo is a concept that means that you understand the other language, but you cannot speak it. but the other person understands your language, although they don't speak it. And this is somewhat what happens between Portuguese and Spanish, or Spanish and Italian, even French, Catalan. I mean, there are these kind of ecumenes of common languages in the sense of the natural languages. But I think this also is true for theoretical ecumenes, so to speak. And we very often communicate through these anthropological traditions and national traditions. We communicate because we have similar theoretical frameworks. So, for example, in my case, I'm interested, and I've always been interested in political economy issues, and I go wherever I think I'm going to find people working in this tradition, wherever, even if it's in India or if it's in any other places in the world, not only within anthropology as a discipline, but also without anthropology, so in other disciplines. And for me, this is very important. It is as important as these other communities in the process of knowledge production, but also in the process of producing power differentials within this knowledge production. Because these power differentials within this knowledge production, which is what the aim of World Anthropology's network was, and I think what the aim of the World Council of Anthropological Associations is as well, this overcoming of these power differentials in knowledge production relates to both particular histories of the discipline and the relation of the power relations between nations and between anthropological traditions, but also the power relations between theoretical frameworks within these traditions. And I have a very clear example. For example, when I was a student in Spain in the 1970s, a student of anthropology, the main cleavage was not a national cleavage. That is, obviously, we were very aware that there was this hegemonic anthropology in the Anglophone anthropology, UK and US, with different versions of anthropology in each case, and also the French tradition was very important. But what really was important was the theoretical frameworks and the power that different theoretical frameworks had within the anthropological environment in Spain and in Catalonia in particular. So I wouldn't, finally, I mean, I really wouldn't want to leave that aspect out of the conversation about what the World Council of Anthropological Associations wants to do. So if we are thinking of superseding metropolitan hegemonies, it is also because we are thinking that hegemony in whichever kind is probably not a good thing in order to have a proper conversation. And I include in these hegemonies the issue of the theoretical framework. So just to finish now, I want to speak about this issue of language and about the relationship between the production of anthropological knowledge and language. And I think there is an important tension that we need to keep, to be aware of, because if I think of the relationship between language and knowledge production and the production of power differentials in anthropology within, for example, in Spain, I would say that Catalan anthropologists have used language differentiation, so very consciously have been using language as a way to resist hegemony. So writing in Catalan, even if they could write in English, was a way to preserve this assault of the hegemonic knowledge. No? And I think something similar can be seen probably in Canada or in Belgium, etc. And these like bilingual environments. No? And obviously in Spain, in Catalonia, this was a power relationship or a resistance, an attempt to create an identity in the knowledge produced by Catalan anthropologists in relation with Spanish, but also in relation with English. And I think that what many of us feel is that most non-Anglophone speaking anthropologists have this issue with English. So on the one hand, there is the lingua franca kind of aspect of the language, which is, we all think it's a good thing. On the other hand, we also want to maintain a certain identity of thought, if you might speak that way, no? Like a way of producing knowledge that relates to language. So there is a tension between claiming identity and resisting hegemony through language, through the use of a particularly non-Anglophone language, but also there is a need to communicate. And these need to engage in conversations very actively and to engage in collaborations is what very often pushes us towards using English, whatever kind of English we can manage to use. But obviously not all the anthropologists are in the position to learn English, because this is at a cost, and I mean a financial cost, and not all the anthropologists are capable to really communicate in English. So I think we have to think about that. But moreover, I think what's more important even, and this is, I'm finishing with this, is that that these conversations really, the fact, this tension between identity, between keeping a certain identity and on the other hand, trying to communicate widely, what this highlights is the issue of value and of recognition. Because in fact, we are talking about exchange, and we could use a metaphor, really a very economic kind of metaphor, no? I mean, we produce concrete values, and then we have to exchange them, and obviously then we get into an exchange mode value. So we could think about the different currencies and the translation into one currency, something, for example, that has happened in Europe with the euro, and what does that mean in terms of power? Because obviously for Europe, the euro currency has had a very particular effect in power terms. And I think this metaphor is something that we need to keep in mind, no? This tension. Well, I only want to say that this issue of language is complicated. We have to address it. I think we are addressing it. I think the World Council of Anthropological Associations is really helping not only anthropologies, hegemonic anthropologies, become aware that other anthropologies exist and start to recognize the value of these other anthropologies. And I think that the Committee for World Anthropologies of the AAA is an example of the power that the World Council of Anthropological Association has had in this awareness making. But I also think that this language issue should be really taken very seriously. And I think one solution might be what Susanna was pointing at, really having the World Council of Anthropological Associations pressure the IC Thompson, for example, and other indexes to accept journals that are not in English. So internationalization does not mean publishing in an English journal. And the other thing is that I would want to say that the initiative, for example, that the incoming editor of the American Ethnologist, who is Nico Besnier, has an initiative which I hope he's going to be able to carry out successfully, and I think the World Council for Anthropological Associations should support this initiative, which is the fact of accepting submissions in different languages, and very widely, different languages, including Japanese and Chinese and all sorts of languages which are not European in origin. And I think this initiative is a very important initiative, and if other journals out there who publish, that publish in English could do the same, probably the language issue would be transformed into some other language issue, but a different one. So anyway, I think, I don't know if we have any time.
Thank you, Susanna. Thank you, Susanna. And I know that we would love to debate the many things that have been said since early this morning here today, but we are running late. And I would like to thank very much my distinguished colleagues. The good thing about working with the WCAA is that every one of the colleagues that come and stay and contribute to the WCAA is an important and leading person per se. And so we all know that when you invite somebody that is engaged with the WCAA, you have an excellent end result. And I think that this panel was a confirmation that the WCAA also puts together very interesting people. And I'd like to thank you all for these very thoughtful papers you presented here. And I now call Professor Junji Koizumi, who is going to host the next session with Professor Leslie Aiello presenting her lecture. Without further ado, we will just start Leslie's lecture. Thank you all.